The air in rural Tennessee in the year of our Lord 1887 was not a gentle thing. It was a thick, breathing entity, heavy with the scent of pine rot and damp earth clinging to the skin like a shroud. In the hollows between the rolling, shadowed hills of Appalachia, progress was a rumor whispered by travelers, a distant plume of smoke from a train that never stopped here. Life was governed by the rise and fall of a merciless sun, the word of God as interpreted by flawed men, and the deep, abiding silence of the woods. It is in one such hollow, carved out of the wilderness by calloused hands and stubborn faith, that our story takes root, like a poison ivy vine strangling the life from a forgotten headstone. Here stood the Blackwood Farm, a place that even then felt older than its years, its clapboard siding weathered to the color of bone, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at a world it wanted no part of. The land itself seemed to shun the property. The corn grew in stunted, anemic rows. The oaks surrounding the perimeter were twisted into tormented shapes, their branches like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. This was the domain of Josiah Blackwood, a man carved from the same hard, unforgiving stone as the mountains that loomed over his life. And it was here, within the suffocating confines of his world, that he would build a tomb, not for the dead, but for the living. Josiah Blackwood was not born a monster. Monsters are rarely born. They are forged. They are hammered into shape in the quiet furnaces of piety and fear, tempered in the cold waters of isolation. He was a man of the cloth. Though he held no pulpit save for his own hearth, his congregation a captive audience of 2 small children and a wife who had long ago learned that silence was the better part of survival. His God was not a deity of mercy or love, but a wrath. Fool, Old Testament architect of suffering, a being of infinite scrutiny who saw sin in a child's laughter, damnation in a moment of idleness. Josiah's days were a rigid liturgy of labor and prayer. From the pre-dawn gloom until the last vestiges of twilight were swallowed by the forest, he would work the unyielding soil, his movements jerky and precise, his face a mask of grim determination. But his true work began when the sun went down. By the flickering, accusatory light of a single kerosene lamp, he would read from a cracked leather Bible, his voice a low, monotonous drone that filled the small house with scripture and dread. He spoke of hellfire and brimstone, of the wickedness that lurked in the hearts of men, and most of all, of the sacred duty of a father to purify his own bloodline, to shield his offspring from the world's pervasive stain, to cauterize the soul before it could be infected by temptation. His wife, Martha, was a ghost in her own home, a creature of faded calico and quiet sighs. She had once possessed a light, a warmth that Josiah, in his early courtship, had mistaken for purity. He soon came to see it as a vulnerability, a gateway through which the devil might enter his sanctum. So he had snuffed it out, systematically, with years of scripture-laced criticism, with a silence that was more damning than any blow. She moved through the rooms like a wraith, her footsteps so soft they were barely audible, her presence a constant, trembling apology. Her role was to cook, to clean, to be an effigy of obedience, and to watch as the shadow of her husband grew, consuming everything, most especially her children, Elias and Elara. Elias was 8, a boy with his mother's wide, curious eyes, and a spirit that had not yet been fully broken. Elara was 6, a wisp of a girl with hair the color of corn silk, who still believed in the goodness of things, who still saw the world as a place of wonder rather than a testing ground for eternal damnation. It was this very innocence that Josiah found so terrifying. It was, to him, a pristine surface upon which Satan longed to etch his filthy graffiti. He saw the devil in the way Elias would chase butterflies in the meadow, a frivolous distraction from toil. He heard Lucifer's whisper in the songs Elara would hum to her cornhusk doll, profane melodies that mocked the sacred psalms. The world outside their blighted farm was, in Josiah's mind, a grand conspiracy, a vast, swirling morass of sin designed to drag his children down into the pit. Every passing stranger, every distant peal of laughter from the town of Havenwood Creek, miles away, every colourful page of a mail-order catalogue that found its way to their door, was a new front in his war against damnation. His paranoia was a living thing, a fungus that grew in the dark corners of his mind, feeding on his fear and his faith. He began to believe that he was a shepherd guarding his flock not from wolves, but from the very air they breathed. And he knew, with the chilling certainty of a divine revelation, that a mere house was not fortress enough. He needed something more secure, a sanctuary, a prison. At the top of a narrow, steep staircase, tucked away at the back of the house, was a door. It was a simple door of rough-hewn pine, no different from any other in the house, but it led to the attic. The attic was a place of forgotten things, a repository for broken furniture, dusty heirlooms from a past Josiah wished to erase, and the palpable weight of disuse. It was a space beneath the oppressive slant of the roof, a triangular void of stifling heat in the summer and bone-aching cold in the winter. It was perfect. The decision, when it came, felt to Josiah not like a choice, but a holy mandate. It was a scorching afternoon in late August, the kind of day where the heat warps the very air. He had found Elias and Elara by the creek, their bare feet splashing in the cool water there. Their faces alight with a simple, uncomplicated joy that struck him as profoundly dangerous. They were not praying. They were not working. They were simply being. And in their being, in their untroubled innocence, he saw the glistening lure of the serpent. That evening, after a dinner eaten in suffocating silence, he took them by their small hands. His grip was not violent, but it was absolute, the grip of a man who believes he is acting on behalf of God. Martha watched, her face a bloodless canvas of terror, but she said nothing. To protest would be to side with the devil. He led them up the creaking stairs, the children's bare feet scuffing against the dusty wood. They did not cry. Not yet. This was their father. He was the source of all law and all safety in their small world. They trusted him, even as the air grew thinner, hotter, as they ascended into the gloom. He opened the attic door, revealing a maw of darkness that smelled of ancient dust and dead insects. He nudged them forward, into the black. "The world is a snare," he intoned, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Here, you will be safe from it. Here, you will be clean." He pulled the door shut, the sound a dull, final thud, and then the metallic scrape and click of a newly installed bolt sliding home. From inside, a moment of confused silence was followed by a small, questioning voice. "Papa?" It was Elara. The only answer was the sound of his footsteps descending the stairs, each tread a nail being hammered into the coffin of their childhood. The first few days were a blur of confusion and terror. The darkness was absolute, a physical presence that pressed in on them, muffling sound and stealing breath. They huddled together on the rough floorboards, two small, trembling islands in an ocean of black. They called for their father, for their mother, their voices raw and then hoarse, until they understood the futility of it. Their only visitor was their father once a day. They would hear his heavy, deliberate footsteps on the stairs, the rattling of the bolt, and the door would creak open just enough for him to place a single bucket of water and a tin plate of dry cornbread and beans on the floor. He never spoke to them. He rarely even looked at them. His face, framed for a moment in the dim light from the hallway, was impassive, the face of a jailer performing a necessary, dispassionate duty. The sliver of light from the briefly opened door was a torment, a fleeting reminder of a world they had lost. Then the door would shut, the bolt would slide, and the darkness would rush back in, thicker and more complete than before. Their world shrank to the dimensions of the attic, to the feel of the splintered wood beneath their fingers, the taste of stale water, the sound of each other's breathing. There was a single, small window at the far end of the attic, but Josiah had nailed thick, rough-sawn boards over it, both inside and out. Yet through the tiniest of cracks, a sliver of the outside world persisted. By day, it was a razor-thin line of brilliant, painful light. By night, it was a sliver of silvered moonlight, or the impenetrable black of a starless sky. This sliver became their calendar, their clock, their oracle. They would press their faces to the crack, taking turns to peer through, describing to each other the shifting colors of the sky, the distant, indistinguishable shape of a bird, the way the rain-slicked leaves of the oak tree glistened. It was their only connection to the passage of time, the only proof that a world beyond their prison still turned. The years began to bleed into one another, a long, seamless river of grey. Seasons were marked not by the turning of leaves, but by the subtle shifts in their suffering. Summer was a furnace that baked the air out of their lungs, the attic a convection oven where the tar in the roof shingles would bubble and melt, filling the space with a cloying, chemical stench. Their skin would be slick with a perpetual film of sweat and grime, and the water in the bucket would grow warm and foul within hours. Winter was a frozen hell, a damp, penetrating cold that seeped through the thin walls and settled deep in their bones. They would huddle together under a pile of moth-eaten blankets their father had tossed in one day without a word, their bodies racked with shivers, their breath pluming in the frigid air. They learned the architecture of their prison intimately. They knew every rafter, every nailhead, every loose floorboard that moaned under their weight. Their world was a symphony of subtle sounds, the skittering of mice in the walls, the drone of a wasp trapped against the boarded window, the relentless drip of water into a tin can during a storm. Below them, life went on, a tormenting echo of what they had lost. They could hear the faint murmur of their father's prayers in the evening, the rhythmic thump of his axe splitting wood in the yard, the scrape of their mother's chair as she sat down to a solitary meal. They never heard her voice. She had been silenced as surely as they had been entombed. Did she weep for them? Did she argue? Or had her faith become as twisted as his, believing this cruelty to be a form of salvation? They would never know. The silence from their mother was, in many ways, a greater damnation than their father's actions. It was an abandonment of the soul. Childhood did not just fade, it putrefied. The slow, creeping horror of their existence was malnutrition. The meager rations were enough to sustain a miserable existence, but not to fuel the growth of young bodies. They grew taller, but not stronger. They became etiolated, like plants starved of sunlight, their limbs too, thin and stick-like, their skin a pale, almost translucent grey. Their hair grew lank and lost its lustre. Their eyes, accustomed to the perpetual twilight, became huge and dark in their sunken faces. Hunger was a constant companion, a dull, grinding ache in the pit of their stomachs that sharpened into a predatory beast. They would dream of food, of warm bread and roasted chicken, of the sweet taste of a fresh-picked apple, and wake up to the gnawing emptiness and the metallic tang of stale water. Their minds, too, began to decay. Memories of the outside world, once sharp and vivid, began to soften and blur at the edges. The green of grass, the blue of the sky, the warmth of the sun on their skin. These became abstract concepts, like fairy tales they had once been told. They forgot the faces of other children, the sound of a melody, the feeling of running through an open field. Their language, starved of new words and experiences, began to wither. They spoke to each other in low whispers, their vocabulary shrinking until it was composed of only the essential things: water, bread, cold, dark, hurt. They developed their own private language, a system of taps on the floorboards, of subtle shifts in breathing, a communion of despair that no one else could understand. They were no longer Elias and Ilara, siblings. They were a single entity, a two-headed creature of the dark. Their identities merged in a shared crucible of suffering. For a time they tried to maintain some semblance of their former selves. Ilara would tell stories, her voice a reedy whisper, weaving tales of princesses and enchanted forests from the frayed threads of her memory. But the princesses always ended up locked in towers, and the forests were always dark and threatening. Elias would try to teach her the simple arithmetic their father had once drilled into him, scratching figures in the thick dust on the floorboards. But the numbers seemed meaningless, abstract symbols in a world that had been reduced to pure, agonizing sensation. Despair was not a sudden event, but a slow tide that rose, incrementally, day by day, year by year, until it filled every corner of their existence. Hope was the first thing to drown. Down below, in the world of light and air, Martha Blackwood wasted away. She was a vessel hollowed out by grief and fear, her body succumbing to a quiet consumption of the soul. She died in the 10th year of her children's confinement on a cold autumn morning. Elias and Ilara heard the commotion from above. The unfamiliar sound of the town doctor's carriage, the heavy, unfamiliar footsteps in the house, a low, guttural sound from their father that might have been a sob. They heard the hammering of a coffin being built in the barn. They smelled the strange, cloying scent of funeral lilies that somehow wafted up through the floorboards. They did not know it was their mother who had died. They only knew that a fundamental part of the house's rhythm had changed. After that day, the silence below became even more profound, more absolute. Their father's routine did not falter. The footsteps on the stairs, the rattle of the bolt, the plate of food, the bucket of water. His movements became more mechanical, his presence even more remote. He was a machine wound by God, performing his grim function. He was tending to his specimens, his purified souls, his living sacrifices. If you are still here with me, you understand that the true horror is not the single act of a madman, but the sustained, meticulous cruelty that becomes a way of life. This is not a ghost story, though ghosts are here. It is a story of how faith, when poisoned by fear, can become the most monstrous thing of all. Subscribe to this channel, not for entertainment, but for the testimony of things that must not be forgotten. The community of Havenwood Creek was small, insular, and deeply suspicious of outsiders. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least, they thought they did. They knew Josiah Blackwood. They had built a new reality in the heart of their nightmare because the old one was too painful to recall. They had forgotten their own names. They were simply us. A single suffering consciousness in two broken bodies. The end for Josiah Blackwood came not with a clap of thunder or a bolt of divine judgment, but with the quiet, mundane betrayal of his own body. On a Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1907, his heart, strained by years of hard labor, meager diet, and the immense corrosive weight of his secret, simply gave out. He collapsed on the kitchen floor, his face striking the worn linoleum with a dull thud. His last sight was not of the heavens opening to receive him, but of the dust motes dancing in a sunbeam slanting through the grimy kitchen window. Up in the attic, Elias and Ilara registered the change as a disruption in the rhythm. The morning came and went with no sound of footsteps on the stairs. The gnawing hunger in their bellies sharpened. The day wore on. The sliver of light from the boarded window shifted, faded, and died. Darkness fell, and still, nothing. No footsteps. No rattle of the bolt. Only the profound, unbroken silence of the house below. For the first time in 2 decades, a new feeling entered their dark world, a feeling that was sharper and more terrifying than hunger or cold. Uncertainty. The absolute, predictable tyranny of their existence had been shattered, and they had no idea what came next. Fear, a different and more primal kind of fear, began to bloom in the darkness. It was Silas Cobb, the postman, who finally broke the spell. 2 days passed, and the small pile of mail in Josiah's box remained untouched. On the 3rd day, a Friday, Silas felt a prickle of unease that he could no longer ignore. He dismounted from his horse, pushed open the sagging gate, and walked up the weed-choked path to the front door. He knocked. The sound was swallowed by the house's oppressive silence. He knocked again, louder this time. Nothing. He tried the doorknob. It was unlocked. Pushing the door open, he was hit by a wall of stale, cold air, and something else. A faint, sweet, sickly smell of decay. He called out Josiah's name, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the dead quiet. He took a few steps inside, into the gloom of the front parlor. That's when he saw him, a crumpled shape on the kitchen floor. Silas was not a brave man, but he was a decent one. He backed out of the house, his heart hammering against his ribs, and rode for Sheriff Brodie in Havenwood Creek as fast as his horse would carry him. Sheriff Brodie was a young man, new to the county, and he had only heard the vague, third-hand whispers about the strange recluse at the Blackwood farm. He arrived an hour later with 2 deputies. The scene in the kitchen was straightforward enough. Old man Blackwood, dead of natural causes by the look of him. As Brodie began a cursory search of the house for any next of kin or a will, one of his deputies, a local man named Peters, felt an old unease return. He remembered the stories from his childhood, the rumors about the missing family. "Sheriff," he said, his voice low, "folks used to say he had children." Brodie, focused on the paperwork on Josiah's desk, grunted in acknowledgement, but Peters couldn't shake the feeling. He walked through the silent house, his boots echoing on the floorboards. He felt a draft. It seemed to be coming from the back of the house, from a narrow, steep staircase leading up. At the top was a door. It was the bolt that caught his eye, a heavy iron slide bolt, rusted and formidable, on the outside of the door. Why would a man bolt an attic door from the outside? A cold dread, colder than the air in the house, washed over him. He called for the sheriff. Brodie came and saw the bolt, his brow furrowed in confusion. He looked at Peters, who just shook his head grimly. "Get the crowbar from the wagon," Brodie said, his voice suddenly tight. The sound of the iron crowbar forcing its way between the door and the jamb was a violent, screeching desecration of the house's long silence. The old wood groaned and splintered. With a final, sickening crack, the door burst inward, slamming against the attic wall. For a moment, the 3 men stood frozen on the landing, peering into the abyss. The stench that rolled out was overwhelming, a foul, layered miasma of filth, sweat, sickness, and despair. It was the smell of a cage that had not been cleaned in 20 years. And then, from the deepest, darkest corner of the room, came a sound. It was not a word, not a cry, but a low, terrified whimper, the sound of a cornered animal that has forgotten what it means to be human. Brodie, holding a lantern high, took a hesitant step inside. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a scene from an inferno. 2 figures, huddled together in the far corner, their limbs like bundles of sticks, their skin a waxy, corpse-like white. Their hair was a matted, colourless tangle that hung to their shoulders. But it was their eyes that stopped the sheriff's heart. They were huge, black, bottomless pools of terror, reflecting the lantern light with a wild, uncomprehending panic. They shielded their faces, hissing at the light. The first direct light they had felt on their skin in 2 decades. The light was agony. The sound of the men's voices was a physical assault. The sudden, vast space of the open doorway was a dizzying vortex of terror. Brodie lowered the lantern, his hand trembling. "My God," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. "What has he done?" The discovery of Elias and Elara Blackwood sent a shockwave of horror and guilt through Havenwood Creek. The story was a stain that could never be washed away, a testament to the darkness that had festered in their midst while they had looked the other way. The children, now adults, were removed from the attic, wrapped in blankets like ancient fragile relics. The journey from the dark, silent tomb of their attic into the riotous, sun-drenched world was a new and exquisite form of torture. The sunlight on their skin felt like fire. The colors of the trees and the sky were a violent, painful assault on their light-starved eyes. The chorus of birdsong, the rustle of leaves, the murmur of human voices. It was a cacophony that sent them into trembling, whimpering fits. They could not walk. Their legs, atrophied from decades of disuse, buckled beneath them. They could not speak. The language of men was alien to them. They were, in every meaningful sense, feral. They were taken to the county asylum, a place that was meant to be a sanctuary, but was in its own way just a larger, brighter prison. Doctors and specialists came, full of clinical curiosity and pity. They tried to teach them to speak, to eat with a fork, to wear shoes, to comprehend a world that moved and changed and was not confined by four walls. But the damage was too profound, the roots of their trauma too deep. They had been shaped by the darkness, and the darkness could not be exorcised. They spent their days huddled together in a corner of their small white room, flinching from the light, their hands held up to shield their eyes. They would not be separated, and any attempt to do so would send them into a state of primal, shrieking terror. They communicated with each other in their private language of clicks and gestures, a frantic, silent conversation that no one else could penetrate. They were in the world, but not of it. Their minds remained forever in the attic, trapped in a perpetual twilight of fear. The town's reaction was a complex mixture of horror, shame, and a desperate need to distance themselves from the crime. They condemned Josiah Blackwood, posthumously branding him a monster, a fanatic, a madman. It was easier to cast him as an aberration than to examine the collective silence that had allowed his madness to flourish. The Blackwood farm was abandoned, left to rot. No one would buy the land. No one would tear down the house. It became a local legend, a place of pilgrimage for the morbidly curious, a haunted monument to a terrible secret. They said that on still nights you could still hear sounds from the house, not the whispers of the children, but the low, monotonous drone of Josiah's prayers, a phantom liturgy of fear that had soaked into the very wood and stone. Elias and Ilara did not live long. Their bodies, ravaged by years of malnutrition and neglect, were too weak to sustain them. Elias died first, 2 years after their discovery, from a lung infection that his frail body could not fight. Ilara, deprived of the only other soul who understood her existence, faded soon after. She stopped eating, stopped responding, and simply withered. She died in her sleep 6 months later, her face, even in death, turned toward the corner of the room, toward the darkness that had been her only constant companion. They were buried in the asylum cemetery under a single, simple stone that bore the names they had long forgotten. But the horror did not end with their deaths. The horror is in the questions that remain, hanging in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam. What thoughts occupied their minds during those endless years? What strange, misshapen dreams did they have in the dark? Did they ever forgive the mother who did not save them, or the God in whose name they were sacrificed? And the most unsettling question of all, what becomes of a soul when it is denied the world? Does it shrink and die, or does it transform into something else, something that can only survive in the day? The story of the Blackwood children is not merely a tale of cruelty, but a chilling exploration of what lies at the heart of human endurance and what happens when that endurance is pushed beyond its breaking point. If you find yourself drawn to the abyss, to the stories that lurk in the shadowed corners of history, then this channel is a place for you. Join us and bear witness. The Blackwood house no longer stands. It was consumed by a fire of mysterious origin a decade after the discovery, a conflagration that burned so hot and so fast It left nothing but a blackened scar on the earth and a chimney stack standing like a tombstone against the sky. Some say it was arson, an attempt by the shamed community to erase the physical evidence of their failure. Others whisper that the evil within the house simply consumed itself, that the sheer weight of the suffering and madness contained within its walls reached a critical point and erupted into flame. But the absence of the house does not mean the story is over. The land is still there. The hollow in the hills remains, and those who live nearby say the air there is still cold, even on the hottest summer day. They say the birds do not sing in the trees that now grow over the foundations, that the silence in that place is not an absence of sound, but a presence, a heavy, listening stillness that presses in on you, that feels ancient and aware. The legacy of Josiah Blackwood's faith is a poisoned earth, a lingering dread that has become part of the local folklore. It is a story told to frighten children, a warning against zealotry. But it is more than that. It is a permanent echo, a ripple of darkness spreading outward from a single, locked door. It serves as a terrible reminder that the most monstrous prisons are not built of stone and iron, but of belief. They are constructed in the mind, from the conviction of righteousness and the terror of damnation. And the most terrifying part is not that a man could do this to his own children, but that he did it believing he was saving them. He did it out of love, a love so twisted and curdled by fear that it became indistinguishable from hate. And what of the silence? The silence of Martha, the silence of the neighbors, the silence of the town. That silence is the true ghost that haunts this story. It is a ghost that walks among us still, in every averted glance, in every opportunity to speak, that is met with the comfort of ignorance. The attic on the Blackwood farm is gone, but it was never just a physical space. It is a metaphor for every dark secret, every unspoken horror, every life that is allowed to wither in the shadows because it is easier to look away. And so, the dread remains. It lingers not in the ruins of a burned-down farmhouse in Tennessee, but in the chilling recognition that the bolt on that attic door was forged by a fear that is all too human, and that the capacity for such silence, such profound and terrible apathy, resides in the quiet hollows of us all. The whispers from that attic may have ceased, but if you listen, really listen, in the dead of night, you can still hear the echo. And you might find that it sounds disturbingly like your own silence.